Hello everyone, welcome back to Slovak with Sam, and today your first steps in Slovak. So in this lesson, you will learn the absolute basics and have your first real conversation. You'll also learn all the Slovak personal pronouns and how to conjugate your first 3 verbs. So let's start with a basic conversation at the airport, at customs. Na letisku. Dobrý deň. Dobrý deň. Váš pás, prosím. Nech sa páči. Ďakujem. Ako sa voláte? Volám sa George. Odkiaľ ste? Som z Veľkej Británie. Ďakujem. Nech sa páči. Váš pas. Dovidenia. Dovidenia. So let's go with the vocabulary. Dobrý deň. Váš pas. Nech sa páči. Prosím. Ďakujem. Ako sa voláte? Volám sa. Odkiaľ ste? Som zo. Dovidenia. A few notes. The word for please, prosím, can also mean you're welcome. Next up, when do you use som z and when do you use som zo? Well, if the next word begins with an S or a Z, or sh and zh for that matter, you will have to use zo. This is so that the sounds don't clash in your mouth. Let's take an example. Let's say you're from Zimbabwe, which begins with a Z. So if you try to say som z Zimbabwe, it doesn't really work out. So we add a little vowel in between to just soften it up a little bit so it's not so hard to pronounce. Som zo Zimbabwe. Much better. Moving on to personal pronouns. So let's first go over these and then I'm going to talk a little bit about them. So starting from first person singular. Ja, ty, on, ona, ono, my, vy, oni, oni. So I would like to talk about a few things here. First of all, I'd like to talk about the fact that Slovak has a formal pronoun. A formal pronoun is something that especially English speakers are not going to be familiar with. However, speakers of Spanish, Italian, French will be very familiar with this concept. A formal pronoun is something you use when you're addressing someone in second person singular. However, they are a person of power over you, or they are someone elderly, or they are someone you don't know. Simply said, they are someone who is not your friend. With your friends, you would use ty and the associated second person singular. However, if you don't know the person, or if they're, for example, your boss, or just someone you don't know, or someone you want to show respect to, such as a police officer, you would use the second person plural instead, and use in written form, the capital letter of the v, so v. It sounds the same and conjugates the same as the second person plural. So imagine as if, instead of speaking to one person, imagine that when you have to be formal with them, imagine there's someone behind them, their ego, that you have to talk to as well. So lastly, for the third person, we do have pronouns for he, she, and it, because Slovak will distinguish he, she, and it. That is analogous to English. However, for example, French doesn't actually have a really distinct personal pronoun for it. Slovak does, and there's a deeper reason for the fact that we consider this a personal pronoun, and I will go into it some time later when we talk a little bit more about nouns. However, for now, just remember he, she, and it. And in the plural, we have 2 words, oni and oni. First of all, I would like to highlight how this is an amazing way that the hard and soft E can differentiate words, even in pronunciation. Even if you remember in the first 2 lessons when I spoke about pronunciation, I said that E and E don't actually differ in pronunciation. However, here you can see them beautifully affecting 2 words. E makes the ny softer, the n softer into ny, and so we have to pronounce these 2 words differently, even though they technically do read the same. However, that's a very nice difference that I wanted to highlight. And next up, what does they women mean? Well, in Slovak we have a special pronoun which is used to talk about groups of women, and it has one other use which I will go to in more depth when I do eventually talk about nouns in more depth. That is the reason why this pronoun exists, mostly. However, it can be used to address groups of women. However, it isn't really necessary. You can just use oni in pretty much all cases and everything will be fine. So let's move on from personal pronouns to conjugating your first verb. Don't be intimidated. The verb volať sa, to be called. This will be useful when introducing yourself and asking for somebody's name. So let's go over the conjugations. Ja sa volám. Ty sa voláš. On, ona, ono sa volá. My sa voláme. Vy sa voláte. Oni sa volajú. So we can remember in the conversation, in the dialogue we had, the customs officer asked our friend George, Ako sa voláte? So notice, he didn't know who George was. He met him for the first time, and thus he addressed him formally, using the second person plural. I highlighted in purple the verb endings, which denote the person. In English, you do have to mark the subject, because otherwise you would have no idea who is speaking, or who the verb relates to in a more grammatical sense, who the subject is of the sentence. In Slovak, since the verbs will change depending on the subject, you can usually omit the subject. So instead of saying ja sa volám, you could just say volám sa. Now I'll come back to the subject omission in a little bit. However, just hang in there. We're going to go over one more example. The verb mať sa, to feel. This is a very common verb when Slovaks are asked, how do you feel, or how are you? It's just a colloquial verb that we use to express how we are, how we're doing. Ja sa mám. Ty sa máš. On, ona, ono sa má. My sa máme. Vy sa máte. Oni sa majú. So this is the second verb that you can use to practice your conjugations. I would suggest practicing these and memorizing these two verbs in all the 6 persons. These will be very common and they will be very useful to you on your journey learning Slovak. And would you know it, we've actually learned all about one whole class of verbs in Slovak. So a lot of verbs that end in ať, in the infinitive, will have this exact same conjugation. And I will show you the template for that conjugation in a little while. However, some verbs that conjugate the same as these two verbs are mať, to have, and padať, to fall. So let's go over those endings a little bit more generically. Here they are, very generically written out. The little sign over there is actually the lengthener mark, which means that, for example, in the verb volať, volať sa, it's actually a short a in there. However, we'll make it into a long a and then attach the appropriate ending. So these are the endings. I don't recommend memorizing them alone. I would suggest you to practice conjugating the verbs. I have mentioned total 4 verbs that you can memorize. However, I've provided full conjugations for 2 of them, and those will be enough for you to learn. I would suggest highly to memorize those verbs. You will internalize this whole conjugation structure, and all the other conjugations will become much simpler because, in essence, all Slovak verbs in the persons tend to end with these specific endings. So m for first person, sh for second person, me for first person plural, te for second person plural, and the third persons are usually the weird ones, the ones that change from verb to verb, minor irregularities. However, most of the time, identifying the verbs should be quite easy if you memorize this first class of verbs, so the 2 ones that I provided. Now, remember I mentioned this little omitting the subject thing. You will notice that when I said ja sa mám, without the subject, is mám sa. You'll notice the sa part has moved, and similarly, if you were attentive, you will have noticed that in the infinitive, the sa is at the end, behind the verb. However, when we conjugate it like this, it's in front. Now, why is that? So the reflexive particle sa, it is used to reflect that the subject is more present at the action that is being done, or that the action somehow pertains to the subject. So for example, if you are called something, then that is your name, that is how you are called. It doesn't relate to anyone else, and you could almost say that the subject and the object of the sentence are one and the same thing. However, that's obviously not quite grammatically correct. However, that's what the reflexive particle, so to say, represents. It's not a sound definition, however. For many, many languages other than English, sadly, this will be quite an ingrained concept. So these are concepts very native to, for example, German and French. So let's look over the two cases. So the particle sa will always be after or before the verb. It will never be separated from the verb because it's a part of the verb. There are two cases then. Before the verb, after the verb. So when is it after the verb? First of all, in the infinitive. We've already seen that. However, when we actually use it in sentences outside of the infinitive, it all depends on whether the subject is present or not. When the subject is not present, that means when you omit the subject, the sa will come after the verb, such as in the infinitive, which doesn't have a subject, and for example, when omitting a subject in sentences such as volám se Samuel. And questions, where you're asking a group of people, for example, you're asking someone without using a question word. So, učíte sa? Are you learning? The verb učiť sa means to learn, and we will go over that sometime in the future, the full conjugation of it. However, I would like to note how we were able to identify that it pertains to you, as in group of people, because of the ending of the verb being te. I've mentioned that that is quite similar, even if the verbs are different. Now let's go over the second case, where the subject is present, and that is when the sa will be before the verb. Now, same sentence as we had, volám se Samuel, the sa being after the verb. When we add the subject back, when we choose not to omit it, you'll notice that ja sa volám Samuel, the sa comes before the verb. It's the same sentence, however, without the subject being omitted. It is more Slovak, more native, to omit the subject. However, this is a perfectly correct sentence. And in questions, well, questions will often start with a question word, such as why, what, where, who, how. And here is one of those questions. Ako sa máš? How are you? You'll notice the sa is before the verb. A takeaway from this, the sa will always be in the second place in the sentence. Let's go over one last verb before we end today. Now, it's been a lot of information to process, however, these are the basics that you should probably spend some time learning and learn them thoroughly. Let's go over the most basic of verbs, the most important of verbs, and the most irregular of verbs. The verb to be, byť. Ja som, ty si, on, ona, ono je, my sme, vy ste, oni, sú. This verb will be used a lot of times in the Slovak language, so if you're going to memorize anything from this video, please do memorize this verb. It's very important. It's integral to many questions, as we've already seen. For example, where are you from? Odkiaľ ste uses, once again, the second person plural conjugation of the verb to be. So with that, thank you very much for watching, thank you very much for tuning in, and I will be bringing you some more lessons shortly. Thank you for watching, bye-bye.